In this video, we're going to learn how to build form wizards using Django, and we're going to learn about a library called FormTools that can very easily help us build these form wizards. So what we're going to do is build a form that's divided into 3 steps. The first step is going to be simply getting contact details from the user. The second form, or the second step, will be to collect business information if the user is a business account. So this is going to be a conditional form in our form wizard. And finally, in our last step, we're going to add a booking form. So you can imagine this being a system that lets a user book into a hotel in a particular room. We're going to build a 3-step form wizard in this video. Now you might be asking, if you don't know, what is a form wizard? Let's go to a page I've got open here in Code Sandbox. You can see this is built with React, but it doesn't matter what it's built with. We have a form on the right hand side here, and it's a step-by-step form. When we click next here, we don't submit the form, we're taken to the next step. And that's what a form wizard does. It takes you through a set of steps and it simplifies a long form into some discrete steps. And finally, when you submit the last step, it will actually send that data to the server. So we're going to learn how to build that with Django in this video. So I'm going to close this Code Sandbox, and we have open here a GitHub repository containing some starter code for this video. You can clone that into a directory on your machine, and then you can get started following along with the video. I have that directory open on my computer, and I have a virtual environment activated with Django installed. Now what we're going to do is use a library called FormTools in this video. So I'm going to go to the documentation for this, and actually this library used to be part of Django core, but I think it was removed in 1.8 and extracted into its own package. Now this library has some utilities that are useful for working with forms, and there's 2 main tools. We have a helper for previewing forms before submitting, and also what we're going to use, the wizard view. Now I'll link this page below the video. If we click the form wizard section, we're taken to the page for that functionality. So we're going to work on this page throughout the video, but if we go back to VS Code, I'm going to install the django-formtools dependency, and it's pip install django-formtools, and I'm going to install a specific version, and that's 2.3, so 2 equal signs and then 2.3. And the reason for that is that there's a new version, 2.4, but the functionality we're using here seems to be broken with that new version, and there's a GitHub issue on this topic which I'll link to in the video, but we're going to use 2.3, which works perfectly fine. And I'm also going to install another library that we're going to use very slightly in this video, and that's django-crispy-forms. So pip install django-crispy-forms, and once we've done that, we can clear the terminal and we're ready to get started. Now we've cloned a project from GitHub. There is a migration there, and I'm going to run python manage.py migrate to create the database, and then we're going to take a look at the models that we have in the starter repository. And we have 3 models there. One is a very simple business model that contains the name of a business. The second model is the imaginary hotel guest that has a first name, a last name, an email, a phone, and also a foreign key to a business, and that foreign key is nullable. It may not exist. And our final model in this models.py file, we have a booking model. So when a user submits this form, we want to create an imaginary booking in this hotel system. So we have a guest foreign key. We also have a room type, and that's the type of room that the user is going to use, and that's a choice field. And it's either a single room, a double room, or a family room. And finally, we have the date of the booking and also the number of nights that the user is going to be staying. So that's our models. I've built these in advance so that the video is not too long. What we're now going to do is go to settings.py. So let's bring that file up, and we're going to add the 2 newly installed apps to our installed apps setting. That's a list of installed apps. So let's specify crispy_forms to add django-crispy-forms. And we're also going to add the other app that we're installing here, and that's FormTools. That'll allow us to build this wizard in Django. So add that to installed apps. And once that's done, we can go back to the form wizard documentation. And we're going to look through some of these sections here. Firstly, the how it works section. And we've kind of seen that in the example on Code Sandbox. You fill in the first form and submit that. The server then validates the data, and it redisplays the form if there's any errors. If there's no errors, you progress to the next step of the form. And for every step in the form wizard, this process repeats, and finally you submit the entire form for all steps to the server. So that's how a form wizard works in general. Let's go down to this usage section here to see how this library helps. And what we do here is we define a number of form classes. It's 1 class per page in the wizard. And once you've created your forms, what you're going to do is define a wizard view subclass, and this handles all steps of the form wizard for you. And this is a class-based view that provides some familiar methods such as get context data, and it allows you to customize the behavior of the wizard. Once you've done that, you can then define a template or a set of templates that will then render the forms on the page for the users. And as it says here, you can define a single generic template for all forms in the wizard, or you can have a specific template for each one of them. And the only other things we need to do is make sure that Form Tools is in our installed apps, which we've just done, and then we add a URL that points to the WizardView subclass. So I think that's enough talking from me. Let's get started actually building this. So let's go to VS Code, and we're going to go to the forms.py file, and we have an import at the top here of the Django form module. Now what we're going to do is we're going to build forms for each of these models here. Firstly, we're going to build a form that allows a guest to enter their contact details. So we're going to create a model form that's tied to the guest model, and that's going to be the first form in our form wizard. So let's go back to our forms.py file, and we're going to create a class here called guest_detail_form, and this inherits from the ModelForm class from Django. And what we're also going to do at the top is we're going to import the guest model from core.models. So once we've done that, we can then go back to our form, and we're going to define a meta class here, and we're going to specify here that the model form is tied to the guest model, and we're going to add all the fields from that model: the first name, the last name, the email, and the phone number. And actually to this model form, we're going to add an extra field that determines whether the guest is a business user or not. So I'm going to add some choices here, and this is a list of tuples where we map the value yes on the front end to true on the back end, and no on the front end to false. And what we're going to do below that is create another field called isBusinessGuest, and that's going to be equal to a forms.boolean field here, and we're going to pass a widget to this form field, and that's going to be the radial select widget, and we're passing the boolean choices that we have above to that radial select. And we can also make this field not required by stating required equals false here. So this is our first form class. What we're now going to do is go to our views.py file, and here we're going to create an instance of the Form Tools session wizard. So let's go back to the documentation for Form Tools. After we've defined our form class, we have this section here on creating a WizardView subclass. And there are two options here. We can use the SessionWizardView or the CookieWizardView. We're going to choose the session, and what that class will do is for each step in the form wizard, it will store the user's details in the session dictionary for that user. And when we get to the final form and we submit the entire thing, it will then submit that from the session data as well as the post request. And you can see here in the documentation that the only requirement for these subclasses of the wizard view is that they implement a done method. So let's go back to views.py, and at the top I'm going to bring in a couple of imports here. First of all, the session wizard view, and secondly the form that we've just created, the guest detail form. Now let's remove the index view, we don't need that here, and we're going to create a class here called booking wizard view, and that will inherit from this session wizard view that we've imported at the top. Now one of the fields that we can define on the session wizard view is the form list, and that is a list of each form in the wizard. At the moment we only have one form, and that's the guest detail form. We'll add that to that list, and what we're also going to do is we're going to add the template name here as a field, and the template that we're going to use for these forms is the core/index.html, and that is this template here. If I click that, you can see it only says hello at the moment. We're going to change that in a second. That's going to be the template for all the forms in our wizard. And the final thing we need to do is implement a done method here. So we're going to do that, and we're going to return a simple string from the HTTP response, and we can import the HTTP response class at the top of the file here. So that's our session wizard view. What we now need to do is go to the index.html and actually render this form. If we go back to the documentation and we scroll down after this section on creating the wizard view, we have this section here called creating templates for the forms. And what I'm going to do here is simply copy the code below here. We have a block of code here, and we can then paste that into the index.html template. So let's go back to VS Code and go to that template. And I'm simply going to replace this with the code from the documentation. Make sure at the top that you're extending the correct base template. It's core/base.html. But other than that, this will actually work quite well. And note that the template has an object called wizard that defines several attributes such as management form, and also a step object that tracks the number of steps in the form wizard, and so on. We have the raw form itself down here as a form, and I've formatted this a little bit better so we can see some of these aspects. We have a head block here that is coming from the base.html. So within the head tag, I've defined another block called head, and that's where we inject the media here for the wizard library, and the rest of the code lives within a block for the content. Now the final thing we need to do to see the first step of this form wizard is go to urls.py, and what we're going to do is replace the view that is being called here. And instead of that, we're going to call the booking wizard view, and of course that's a class-based view, so make sure you call the asView function. If we save that, we can then run the Django development server, and we can go to the page here, and as you can see, we have this very simple form. It contains the 4 fields from the model, as well as that custom isBusinessGuest field, and that's a radio select field where we can choose either yes or no. And at the top, you can see some information that's coming from the wizard object in the template, step 1 of 1. So at the moment, this form wizard only has 1 step. In a minute, we're going to add some more steps, but what I'm going to do very quickly is add django-crispy-forms so that this looks a little bit better. And all we need to do is go to settings.py, and underneath installed apps, I'm going to add another setting here, and that's going to be called crispy-pack-template. And I'm going to set that equal to bootstrap 4. We can then save that, and we're going to go to Bootstrap's documentation. And what we need to get here is the CSS for Bootstrap 4. We can then paste that into the base.html, and that can go in the head tag at the top. So just paste that in there, and we can then close base.html, and we're going to go back to the index.html, and at the top here we can load the crispy forms tags, and then we can go down to where the form is actually rendered, and that's here as table. We can then render it using the crispy template filter, and we can do the same down in this else block as well. We just simply append the crispy filter. If we then save this and go back to our page and refresh this form, we see that it looks a little bit better, but actually I've made a mistake here. If we go back to the settings.py, this setting here should not be crispy pack template. It should actually be crispy template pack. So I've got the words the wrong way around there. If we save the new variable with the correct name and refresh this page, you can see this looks a lot better now. It's using Bootstrap 4 to render each field in the form. So let's now move on to creating the form wizard. We're going to create the second form in this wizard. So let's go back to the forms.py file. And this time we're going to create another model form. It's going to be called business detail form. And this again is going to take a meta class, and it's going to link to the business model that we defined. And there's only one field on that model, and that's the name of the business. So we'll specify that in a tuple. And of course, we need to also import the business at the top here from the models.py file. So let's save that and go back to the models quickly. And you can see the business here has a name, and it's also linked to a guest by a foreign key. We're going to deal with these associations a little bit later when the user submits the entire form. For now, what we need to do is add this second form to the form wizard. So let's go back to views.py, and within the form list, we're going to add the form here. But what we need to do is import the form. So let's copy this name of the form. It's business detail form, and we'll import that at the top of views.py, and then we can add it to this list of forms for our form wizard session view. If we do that and simply go back to the page now and refresh, you can see that now the form has 2 steps instead of 1. So let's now try filling this form out to see what happens. So I've now filled each field out, and we're specifying that this is a business guest. If we submit this, we are now taken to the second form in the form wizard, and we can now submit that entire form because that's the last step in the form, and we get back the form submitted message, and that is coming from the done method here in the session wizard view. So it's very easy to simply add another form to this form list, and we're now going to add a final form, and that's for the final model in our models.py file. That's the booking model. So let's go back to forms.py, and at the bottom here I'm going to define a new model form called booking detail form, and within the meta class here we're going to link the model here to the booking. And we need to import booking, so we can do that from the models.py file. Once we've done that, we can define what the fields that we want to have in the form are. So let's define a fields tuple here, and we want to have room type, the date, and the number of nights. And we can also add a widgets property to the meta class, and I'm going to do that for the date field. I want that to be of type date, so it's going to be an input type date on the front end. So that's our booking detail form. Let's copy the name of that and go back to views.py. We can import that from the forms module and then simply add it to this form list within the class. If we then save that, we can go back to the page, and now we have a form that has 3 steps. So I'm going to fill this first form with some details. When we submit that, we're taken to the second form. When we submit that, we're now taken to a third form, and we have this choice field here where we can select a room type. We can then select a date, because this is a date field, and then the number of nights. Let's say we're staying for a long time at this hotel. When we finally submit that, that is the form wizard done. That goes to this method here on the class called done, and we can then process the data however we'd like. So at this point, we've got a form wizard that's working and it's functional on the front end. Now we're going to fix 2 things in the remainder of this video. Firstly, we have the conditional second form. Basically, the business form should only be shown if the user selects yes. On the other hand, if they select no, we don't want to show the business form because that user or that guest is not a business guest. We can do this using conditional forms in the wizard. We're going to see how that works. And the other thing we are going to do is basically handle how the form is submitted, and we're going to create the data in our database. And that will include not only the fields that we see on the form, but we're going to handle creating all the foreign keys and associations between the models. So let's start by creating the conditional second form for the business user. Let's go to the documentation here, and we have a section here on being able to conditionally skip certain forms in our wizard. And we can do this by defining a condition dictionary that can be passed to the asView method, or it can be defined directly on our view class. We're going to do that here. So below the template name in views.py, we're going to define a condition dictionary here. And the key for that dictionary is going to be 1, and that's because it's the second form in our list. And this is 0 indexed, which means we're going to be applying this condition to the business detail form. And we only want to show that if a particular condition evaluates to true. Now the condition for showing the business form is going to be that the user has selected yes to this question. So what we're going to do is define a callable, a function, and that function is going to determine whether the answer to this question is yes or no, and then it's going to return true or false based on that. So what we're going to do is here in the value for this key, we define a callable called showBusinessForm. And we're going to write that function above the view here. It's called showBusinessForm, and it takes the form wizard as a parameter. Now what we want to do here is we want to define a variable called cleanData, and we're going to use the wizard to get the cleaned data for a particular stage or step in our form. So the wizard has a function called getCleanedDataForStep. Now this data is going to come from the very first form in our list here. It's the guest detail form. So the step is going to be 0 for that. And if we don't have cleaned data for that step, we'll just default to an empty dictionary. And then what we want to do is we want to return cleanedData.get. And the field that we want to check is called isBusinessGuest. So we're going to copy the name of that from the form definition and we paste it in here. And that's going to be true or false. It's going to be true if the user selects yes to this question, in which case we want to show the second form here. So this condition dictionary in that case will evaluate to true. And if the user selects no to this question, it's going to be false, and therefore it's not going to show the second form here. It's going to skip that based on this condition dictionary. So this callable will basically determine whether or not the second form is shown. What we can then do is, if we go to the done method, what I'm going to do is print the form list that's sent to the server here, and then we're going to go back and fill out the form on the page. So let's fill this form out. Now to start with, we're going to select yes to the isBusinessGuest question, and then when we submit that, we can get taken to the second step in the form, and then we can progress from there as normal. And if we fill in the last form here and submit this, if we go back to the server, you can see that the form list has been printed to the terminal below, and we have all 3 forms in that list that's sent to the done method. Now let's try the opposing case where the user selects no to the isBusinessGuest question. So they're going to select no to that. Let me fill in these fields quickly. Now if we submit this first step in the wizard, we're now taken to the last form, we're not taken to the business form. So that second condition form is conditionally shown based on the answer to one of the questions in the first form. If we now submit this form, we go back to the server and we can see now that the form list that's been sent to the done method only contains 2 forms. That's the guest detail form and the booking detail form. We do not get an instance of the business detail form. It's been skipped in this wizard. So now we've covered conditional forms within the wizard. The last thing we're going to do in this video is handle the submission of this form in the done method. And we're actually going to create the database objects based on the form data. So let's remove the print statement from this method, and I'm going to get the guest form out of this form list. That's going to be the first form in that list, so we index in at 0. We can then once again check the answer to this question here, the isBusinessGuest question, and I'm going to add an if statement here. If that evaluates to true, we're going to process the guest and add the business as a foreign key to that guest. So let's get the business object here, and we're going to get the form list and index in at element 1, so that's the second form in the list, which we know will be the business detail form because the answer to this question is true. And that's a model form, so we can call save to add the business to the database and get the business back as an object or a model here in the view. And let's now retrieve the guest from the guest form that we got on line 19. We can call the form.save method, but we're going to pass commit equals false to that, and that basically means that we're going to save the form and get back the model object, but we haven't saved that model to the database and added the row yet. And the reason that we haven't saved the model is that we're going to add a foreign key here to the business. So we say guest.business is equal to the business that we saved to the database on line 21. And what this is going to do is, for our guest model here, we have this foreign key to a business model, and it's going to create a foreign key in the database linking the guest to the business that's been submitted. If we go back to views.py here, the last thing to do in this block of code is call the save method, and this time we are committing it to the database. We've added the foreign key, so now we call save, but we do not add the commit equals false parameter. So that code in the if statement handles creating a business and a guest. What if there is no business user? In that case, all we need to do is save the guest form. So we call guestForm.save, and that will add the guest to the database. And in that case, when we don't have a business guest, we don't need to bother about saving the business form because that's not going to be in the post request. And we also don't need to worry about attaching the foreign key to the guest. Again, if we go back to the models.py file, we can see that this foreign key is actually nullable. So we can have a null reference for that foreign key in the database. So that's going to work fine. All we need to do is save the guest data to the database. So this code handles creating the guest and the business if that needs to be created. The final thing we need to do is also create the booking. That's the final form in our form wizard. So let's use that final form, and we're going to create a booking object, and it's going to come from the form list, and we're going to get the last form in that list. No matter if there's 2 or 3 steps to our form wizard, we know that the last step is for the booking detail form. So we can then call .save, and again we're going to pass commit equals false to that method. So that will give us back a Django model object, but it won't save the data to the database. And the reason we're doing this again is because we want to attach to the booking a foreign key to the guest that's made that booking. So let's go back to views.py, and we're going to attach the guest that we got in the code above as the foreign key on this booking model. And the last thing we need to do is simply save the booking, and then we are creating hopefully all of the database entities we need to based on the 3 forms in our form wizard. So let's save this and go back to the page. We're going to refresh this page, and I'm going to submit each step of the form, and we're going to see if that creates the correct database entities. So for the first example, we're going to create a business guest, and then we'll pass the name of that business, and we're going to specify a double room, and we can add a start date and the number of nights, in this case 31. If we submit this, we get back the success HTTP response form submitted. What we're now going to do is go to the Django admin and verify that these models have been correctly added to the database. So let's stop the server, and I'm going to run python manage.py create super user. Let's give this user a name of admin, and we'll give it a password of test. Once we've done that, we can then run the server again, and we're going to go to the admin UI in Django, and we can do that with the /admin URL, and we can then log in with our super user. So let's start by checking the business. We can see we have this new business here that's just been created, and hopefully we'll have a guest as well. And you can see we have this guest that's come from the form. And finally, we can go back and we can check the booking table, and we can see we have a booking here. It's the double room for 31 nights that we've just created. So all of these 3 database entities have been correctly created, along with the foreign keys to the different objects. So that's working fine. Let's go back and try one last time. If we go back to the page, this time we're not going to create a business guest. So I've filled in these forms, and we're selecting no to is business guest. If we submit that, we're taken to the final form in this case. And this time we'll say the booking is for 25 nights and submit that. And you can see we're getting an error here, and that's that a local variable guest is referenced before assignment. So let's go back to views.py. And the problem here is actually because in the else clause, when we don't have a business user, I'm not actually assigning the result of calling save on the guest form to an object or to a variable. So what happens when we call save is we get back a guest. We need to use that because we're referencing it below here when we attach the foreign key to the booking. So let's try resubmitting this data now by refreshing the page and continuing. If we go back to the admin UI, if we now go to the bookings table, you can see we now have the booking for 25 nights in a double room. And if we go back to the guest, we now have 3 guests added to the database. But if we go to businesses, we only have 1. So this this workflow for the form wizard is actually valid. There are two ways the form can be submitted, with or without a business, and both ways save the correct data to the database and give us what we'd expect on the UI. Now of course we're only scratching the surface here. You can style up these form wizards any way you like. You can create different templates for different forms, and you can have as many different forms as you want within this form list that's defined on the form wizard. So that's all for this video. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to the channel. If you would like more Django form videos, let me know in the comments. And if you would like to see the other aspect of this form tools library, let's go to the documentation. It's the form preview functionality. Let me know in the comments too. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.